And the Masters of the Universe.
If you were a kid in the 1980s, then these words were forever etched in your vocabulary. Heck, it was even used in the playground as banter. Who do you think you are, He-Man? There is no question how massive He-Man was back in the day. The action figures, comics, the 1987 Dolph Lundgren movie. I liked it personally, unlike so many He-Man fans apparently. But probably the most well-famous aspect of the He-Man franchise, the 1983 cartoon series. This show has forever been with me since I first watched it back in 1986. And what was not to like? This beefy, larger-than-life Herculean strongman with a powerful sword, taking on powerful wizards and monsters whilst defending his home planet of Eternia. My history with He-Man is unlike several other legendary shows that I grew up with. Back in those days we used VHS tapes, and the shows were on like once or twice a week, usually on Saturday morning shows here in the UK. And as I was a little lad back then, I didn't quite grasp the concept on when the shows were. It was just usually my mother telling me when it was on, or I was waiting by the TV on a Saturday, or she just recorded them for me and I watched them later in the day. The whole premise of the show is as basic as can be. Prince Adam as He-Man defends Eternia from Skeletor and his minions. He pulls out his sword and yells out those immortal words. He transforms into He-Man, turns his pet Cringer into a big massive cat, Battle Cat, and goes off to fight Skeletor, and usually ends up saving the day. I mentioned earlier how I watched He-Man on Saturday mornings back in the UK. Over the years I had a collection of VHS tapes of He-Man, and these episodes would permanently stick in my mind. So much so that I could remember almost every line. And as I got older and the technology evolved, I began collecting the DVD releases, and eventually managed to collect all 130 episodes. I was actually shocked that it had that many episodes, and I was even more shocked to learn that the show had a relatively short run from 1983 to 1985. It seemed to be the norm for cartoon shows from that time period. Shows like G.I. Joe ran for only 2 seasons but somehow managed to accumulate a staggering 95 episodes. The legendary Thundercats also ran for 130 episodes but managed 4 seasons. Nowadays those kinds of runs for cartoon shows are very few and far between. Reaching 50 plus episodes of a series is seen as a success. The show had a large number of characters, some of which I didn't even know about until years later, and there's plenty of characters to go through. I will be focusing on the main ones and a few obscure characters. We all know about the main star of the show, He-Man, Eternia's protector against the forces of evil. It sounds so corny when you say it as an adult. He really is Prince Adam in disguise, but once lifting that magical power sword and uttering those words, he becomes He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe. Superman wants a word, by the way. As Prince Adam, he has to try and differentiate himself as much as he can, so as to not give up his secret identity. So he comes off as lazy and aloof and a coward, the stark opposite of He-Man. And besides those who know his secret, he manages to fool everybody. Amazing how He-Man and Prince Adam look like complete twins and absolutely nobody has conned on. Silliness, I think. Yes, it's a cartoon and you're supposed to suspend your belief, but at the very least they could have managed to draw better animations to make the characters look different. Something the 2002 cartoon managed to pull off. As a character, he was larger than life, who young kids attached themselves to, and in their eyes he could do no wrong. Now that changes as an adult, so watching from that perspective makes the character kind of bland. Regardless, he was the hero that the show made him out to be, and he had a repertoire of tricks up his sleeve, including his super strength, his acrobatics, his ability to whistle his vehicles on command. Like I said, it was quite a repertoire. He is portrayed as the ultimate goody two-shoes, who even helps the bad guys every so often. He only resorts to action as a very last-ditch effort. We have Man-at-Arms, his mentor in many ways. Man-at-Arms is a warrior and inventor and creates a most impressive array of gadgets and vehicles. He's an advisor to the king and queen, but he's also the adopted father of Teela. A little side note, As a young kid, when my friends and I knew this, we naturally assumed that the sorceress and man-at-arms were married. At that age, we didn't quite get the concept of adopted. So we went around believing this until we saw the episode Teela's Quest, and my elder sibling had to explain to us the concept of adopted parents, without mentioning the nitty-gritty. There was also comic relief with Orko constantly being a source of irritation. I'd say he was one of the more interesting characters on the show. And then you have Teela, Man-at-Arms' daughter and the captain of the King's Guard. She was She-Ra before there was a She-Ra, just without the powers. She was fearless and determined, and not the damsel in distress. She had a bickering relationship with Adam, constantly frustrated at his laziness and his cowardice, saying Adam could stand to take his royal duties more seriously and learn a thing or two from He-Man. If only she knew. There were a few close calls when she nearly discovered his secret, but she never did find out during the show's run. I did mention the episode Teela's Quest earlier. This episode was an excellent arc for her as it explored her character a little bit more. She is on a mission to find out who her mother is by going to the Crystal Sea to visit the Oracle, seeking answers to her questions. However, she is kidnapped by Merman, and as it turns out, Merman has a long time score to settle with Man-at-Arms. After being rescued by He-Man and avoiding being sacrificed by Merman to the monster Bakul, she discovers that the sorceress is her mother, but is soon made to forget as she has a path to fulfill before taking over as a future sorceress. It was always one of the more memorable episodes of the show. There was always hints at a possible relationship between her and He-Man, but it never came to fruition, and plus at that age, all we really cared about was the action. The other characters were a fascinating mix. You had Orko the magician, who was part of a race known as the Trollans. He was more comic relief and a bit of a nuisance, to be honest. Then you had Cringer, easily the most annoying character in the whole show. His annoying dialogue which portrayed him as a complete and utter coward. There was Stratos, the bird-like being from a race known as the Avion, and his partner Ram-Man. The metallic helmet and his spring-like jump made him a human or Eternian battering ram. Then there was the other members of the Masters of the Universe. Zodak, Roboto, Many Faces, Mechanic, Bozoff, and Fisto. Yes, Fisto. That name just would not fly in today's world. Then there was also King Rando and Queen Marlena. The Queen, as it turns out, is actually from Earth, and she crash landed on Eternia where she was rescued by Randor. The two would end up becoming the King and Queen of Eternia, and she did make this comment to Adam when he asked her about what Earth was like.
Afraid you'd find it kind of boring, Adam. There are no giant green tigers or magical castles, but it's a beautiful place, filled with beautiful people.
Oh boy, they have no idea. No idea at all. The King and Queen I found were very generic and bland. There really wasn't as much character development for either, and even watching back as an adult, I find them very, very dull. Now, unlike later incarnations of Randor, specifically the 2002 series where it's hinted that he may have a connection to Skeletor, it was later confirmed by one of the producers of that series that the two were actually half-brothers. And then we have the Sorceress. I have already mentioned her role in Teela's Quest. She was basically the mystic falcon who is the guardian of Castle Grayskull. And then we move on to the villains. The main baddie of the show, Skeletor, a hooded figure with a skeleton face sticking out. He had his moments and showed that he was a genuine threat to the people of Eternia, and a formidable enemy for He-Man. Now, even though he's the main villain of the story, his portrayal in the series is more bumbling and cowardly. I felt there were other villains in this series who came off more threatening than he did. His constant bickering with his minions, it was reminiscent of Shredder from the Ninja Turtle, always blaming Rocksteady and Bebop for his failures. You had Beastman, who had the ability to mentally control other monsters. But that aside, he too was much of a bumbling oaf. And then there was also Trapjaw, who had the cool ability to change his arms into different weapons of destruction. I already mentioned Merman, after his role in Teela's quest. Most of the time he's just another minion for Skeletor. Possibly Skeletor's most feared minion was Evil Lyn. She was his right-hand lieutenant and the most intelligent of Skeletor's minions. Even though she served alongside Skeletor, she had plans to overthrow him and take his powers for her own. Now in the episode The Witch and New Warrior, she ends up teaming with Teela as both are stranded on the desert, and they both have to work together to get back home. She shows some good traits, but also reveals that she's not loyal to Skeletor, and ultimately seeks to take his powers. This episode highlighted Evil Lyn's character as not just being plain black and white, but had several shades of grey which added to her character. Oh, look at that, she had grey hair. No wonder she wears that hat. He-Man was also very synonymous for all those amazing sound effects. Now, by the time I had amassed my DVD collection, it had been over 20 years since the show first aired, and needless to say, it hasn't really aged well. In terms of the animation, it's the same frames used over and over again, which give it a rather comical look, and it has been used as a subject of ridicule in many fan-made videos over the internet. There were also a number of lines that just would not fly in today's world.
Anytime I can give you a hand, just let me know.
And when Fisto offers you his hand, boy, that's a big offer.
The show did try to convey positive messages during its run. He-Man was the quintessential good guy, so he did not kill Skeletor or any of his minions, and at times he even saved them, even though they would return to conquer Eternia the very next episode. The show also had some life lessons at the end of each episode to highlight the rights and the wrongs of that particular episode. Now, there was one particular life lesson shared, but it wasn't on He-Man, but rather the spin-off, She-Ra Princess of Power. It was talking about young people being inappropriately touched or handled and urging them to come forward and speak about it.
Not easy, Orko. It's hard for a young person to admit that he or she has been touched in a bad way.
If you've been touched that way, don't be ashamed. Tell someone you trust, like your parents, your doctor, your teacher, or counselor, or your minister or rabbi.
As a kid, this just flew over my head. But as an adult, I thought, wow, that was really deep for what was considered that larger kids show. In today's world, those type of PSAs, I don't think they'd work. I think. Now, He-Man can be seen as a big influence for superhero cartoon shows. Some say it influenced another 80s action toon classic in the Thundercats. The show did break boundaries in that it was one of the first Western cartoon shows that allowed for a level of animated violence which had previously been banned. Now granted, it is nowhere near the action seen in future action cartoon shows, but it most definitely paved the way. It leads to a spin-off in the already mentioned She-Ra Princess of Power, He-Man's twin sister. Then there was a new version of He-Man in the New Adventures of He-Man. And then years and years later, there was my personal favourite He-Man show ever, the 2002 Masters of the Universe, which was just brilliant in my eyes. It took most of what we saw in the 80s cartoon and gave it a more contemporary update, which incorporated more action and more mature storylines. It is a future topic I will discuss here on the channel. I should also mention that He-Man would serve as a hotbed for talent, as a number of the makers involved in the show would go on to help create other legendary franchises. Writer Paul Dini would go on to become a writer and producer for legendary DC shows Batman the Animated Series, Superman, and Batman Beyond. Larry DiTillio, also a writer on the show, would go on to write for a ton of other cartoon shows, including The Centurions and The Real Ghostbusters. To look back on this show retrospectively, you can see it for what it was, which was a children's show designed to sell toys. So from a marketing standpoint, it did its job in attracting its target audience. But it proved so successful that even after the show ended in 1985, it still carried on in syndication for several years. Watching it back as an adult, however, the animation looks very outdated, the action is poor and sluggish, and the dialogue is very hokey. You hanker for more action and more drama. So let's just say, it wasn't made for adults. But I love my cartoons, and there are tons of other 80s shows which I feel have aged much better than He-Man. But that said, He-Man is still a huge name in pop culture history, so much so that it has made its way into multiple DVD collections. And there are also plans for 2 new He-Man shows. Only time will tell if these will prove successful or not. Fingers crossed. So to sum up He-Man, not so much a show for my adulthood, but a show that was great for my childhood, and I look back on it with very fond memories indeed.